Now let's talk about should minimum wage be inflation adjusted. Okay. Now the first thing I want to say is in reality, in the United States, minimum wage is not inflation adjusted. Okay. Now here let's check out the real world data. Here on this chart, the blue one, the shaded area, okay, or the curve, shows the nominal minimum wage, okay, expressed in the dollars in that specific year. Okay? And the green one is the real minimum wage. It's adjusted in 2017 dollars. Okay? In other words, the 2017 would be the reference base year. That's why the nominal minimum wage equals real. Okay? Remember, when you see nominal value equals real value, that year must be the base year. Okay. Now here, let's pick 1968 as an example. Okay, because that was the year when we find that the real minimum wage is really around the highest level. Okay, and after that, you would find that the real minimum wage. There are some ups and downs, but for most of the time, the trend is downward sloping. Okay, so here from 1979 to 1995, we find that the real minimum wage decreased by 33%, so 1/3. Okay, and after the year 2000, there's no real growth of the real minimum wage. Okay, now if you just simply focus on the nominal minimum wage, you would probably be under a dead wrong impression. Okay, because in 1968 you would find that nominal minimum wage was below $2 per hour. Okay, and then in 2017 it's $7.25 per hour, right? So you tend to believe that minimum wage increased a lot, okay, more than 300%. However, that's these two nominal dollars or nominal wages are apples and oranges. They are not directly comparable. Okay, once we adjust it for inflation, we find that in 1968 the real minimum wage stays above $10 per hour. Now it's only $7.25. Okay, and this is the reason that Mitt Romney, when he runs his presidential campaign back in 2012, he said that he is not a big fan of minimum wage. However, given that the minimum wage is already in place, it should be adjusted for inflation. Okay? Remember, back in chapter 6, we already said that government is doing all of these to help the poor, right? If the goal is still helping the poor, then of course it should be adjusted for inflation so that the standard of living for the poor won't get worse over time, right? However, when you take a closer look at the trajectory of the nominal minimum wage, you would find that it's kind of stairwise, right? That's because it's always after a few years or sometimes even more than a decade that the U.S. Congress will come back and upward adjust the minimum wage. Okay, but it's always late, right? It's always behind the increase in the overall price level. And here, let me clarify the difference between what we're discussing in this chapter and what we already discussed in chapter 6. In chapter 6, our focus is whether or not we should have minimum wage set on the labor market. Okay? Whether or not. Here, in this chapter, what we are discussing is, given the minimum wage is already in place, whether or not it should be adjusted for inflation. Okay? In other words, what we are saying here is not really against what we discussed in chapter 6. Okay? These are two different issues. All right? Another thing you might think about is, this is a popular argument made by businesses. They would say that, here the real purchasing power of the minimum wage declined over time, probably because the workers become less productive in workplace. Now, the reason could be automation. It could be the new technologies, new equipments used, and so it actually reduce the overall productivity of workers. Okay, let's check out the empirical evidence and see if that is true or not. Now here we're showing you 3 different curves. Okay, the red one is the actual minimum wage. Okay, again, as you can see, it's $7.25 now. Okay, and in 1968, we find all 3 curves intersect. Okay, so that's the beginning of our comparison. And after that, if we follow this dark blue curve, we would find that this one is the minimum wage if it had grown with the productivity. In other words, if how much a worker gets paid by the company depends upon his or her productivity. Okay, we're talking about the typical worker's productivity in the United States. Then in 2016, the worker was supposed to get paid $18.85 per hour, which is way above what they actually get paid. Okay? In other words, the evidence did not support the argument usually made by businesses. So the workers are actually getting more and more productive. They should get more and more pay, but they did not. Okay. Now the light blue curve shows the minimum wage if it had grown with the average wage. In other words, if we're saying that these minimum wage workers, their pay is just going to increase proportionally as other workers. So we're talking about the more skilled workers, the professionals. Okay, then we would find that in 2016, the minimum wage earners should get paid $11.35 per hour. Okay, still way above the current level, $7.25. Okay, now here I would like to clarify that when we see if it had grown with the average wage, it doesn't mean the minimum wage earners are going to get paid as the professionals or other more skilled workers or jobs. It simply means they would grow at the same rate. Okay, so there still have a significant gap between the minimum wage and the average wage. Okay. All right. Now, at this point, some of you probably would think, why would we care about the minimum wage so much? Especially among you guys, after getting the college education, later you are gonna, I would believe that, most of you would get a pretty decent job, right? decent pay, you're gonna get paid way above $7.25. If that is the case, why should we care about the minimum wage? Number one, as we already said back in chapter 6, we do care about the social inequality, income inequality in our society, right? We do care about the living standard of the poor. Number two, here, we believe that the minimum wage actually set the floor for all wages. Okay, now let's check this out. On this chart, we're showing you the average hourly wage in the United States. Okay, we find that here, the very last year, 2014, that's when we see the nominal wage equals the real wage. So that's the base year. Okay, and this brown or orange curve shows the current dollars. That means it's nominal wage. This olive or green curve is the constant 2014 dollars. So this is a real wage. Okay, we find that in 1964 the nominal wage is $2.50. In 2014 it's over $20, so it increased a lot. Okay, about 900%. But when we look at the real wage, we find it's quite disappointing. Okay, so from 1960s all the way to 2014, you find that there are some ups and downs, but the real purchasing power of our wage, average wage, pretty much stagnated. Okay, there's no obvious increase or even decrease over time. Okay, so how is that? Okay, and that's why, if some of you probably pay attention to these news which come out several years ago, it says that American middle class is no longer the world's richest. Okay, we used to be. Now Canadians middle class make more than Americans. Okay? Now here I would ask you to think about the minimum wage, how that affects our average wage. Okay, minimum wage actually set the floor for all wages, and it also becomes the opportunity cost for many workers. Okay, so for example, today you as a college student, you find a part-time job. You probably deliver the pizza for a local restaurant. Okay, and you get paid, let's say, $8 per hour. You probably feel like, it's not that bad, right? Because, it's still higher than $7.25, the federal minimum wage. Okay. Suppose in the morning when you wake up, you learned from the TV that the federal government already raised the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10, okay, $10.10. How do you feel about your $8 per hour wage? You probably feel like, you are definitely underpaid, right? You believe you did a pretty good job, but why they pay you, like $2 less than the federal minimum wage, right? So when the federal government raised the minimum wage, it's not just going to benefit the minimum wage earners. It could benefit way more workers out there. Okay, so these businesses, companies need to pay more to catch up with the increase in minimum wage. Okay, that could help us partially address our income inequality in the United States. Okay, these days when we see that our country is deeply politically divided, here is probably the economic reason. Okay, the middle class is falling far behind compared to the rest of the society, especially the super rich groups. Right. Now let me quickly wrap up this chapter. So we start our discussion about the measures of price levels, especially the CPI and the inflation. And later we talk